Good afternoon. I'm Robert Rodriguez, Chairman, Founder of Security Innovation Network. Honored to be here, especially with a good friend, General Hayden. Thank you for flying out this morning. And like the woman said, there's a little adjustment here. We're going to do a little personal one-on-one interview, touch on cyber. At the end, we'll have a break, and then please join us for the panel afterwards. And then the most important thing is our reception following that. So we're going to talk about General Hayden's public service, the qualities that define leadership, his formative years growing up on the north side of Pittsburgh as the son of a welder, and the persons who impacted his life and direction. The journey from his early days as a taxi driver, not to be confused with Travis Bickle from Robert De Niro's movie Taxi, and young analyst to the director of NSA and then CIA. Michael Vincent Hayden grew up on the north side of Pittsburgh, an area referred to as the Ward. The family moved to Brighton Heights in 1972 when their north side home was raised to make way for Three Rivers Stadium. Ironically, the owner of the Pittsburgh Steelers, Dan Rooney, was General Hayden's 6th and 8th grade football coach. General Hayden's 36-year Air Force career began in 1969. In addition, he served as the Director of National Security Agency, the Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So, General, I want to go back to a 2006 interview where you mentioned you're a passionate Pittsburgh Steelers fan, and you love the team because it is focused on the sport itself. During this interview, you made an analogy about fixing U.S. intelligence using a coaching perspective. Figuring out how to make U.S. intelligence operatives work and work together is like an NFL coach getting the team, quote, to emphasize the scoreboard rather than individual performance. Would you elaborate more on the scoreboard versus the individual, and how we can, as disparate IT security professionals, think about the bigger picture in order for us to act more like a team than as individuals?
Sure. Thanks, Robert. And thank you all for the opportunity to have this chat this afternoon. And as Robert mentioned, I'll be speaking tomorrow on some aspects of cyber war and where I think American military thinking is on the whole concept of cyber conflict. Robert just laid out kind of unity of effort on 3 levels in the NFL and in the intelligence community, and then in the IT community. And frankly, I think unity of effort in the NFL is the easiest of those 3 to put together. Lots of reasons. I think everybody knows their roles, and you know how well you're doing because the scoreboard's up there. Now transfer that imagery, and I know most of you don't live inside the Beltway, but I unfortunately do. Transfer that imagery to the kerfluffle we've just had over the past month or so about the Director of National Intelligence. Okay? And try to imagine now, how does the administration, how does the American government, how do the American people get the unity of effort we would like to have on an NFL team out of the American intelligence community? It's a far more complex task. I'm not sure who the team captain is. I don't think the coach has enough authority over his players. And the impact on the IC, the intel community, is pretty much the impact you'd see in an NFL team under those circumstances. Moving to the world you're more familiar with, I think it's even more challenging. Your expertise is so rich in both its technological sophistication and in its newness that I don't frankly think, to badly mix metaphors, I don't frankly think we've beaten down trails in the forest so we know where the paths are. And the the blessing from your technology and your entrepreneurship and your work over the last several decades has been this tremendous blossoming of technology that's fundamentally changed our lives. And we're trying, and I'll mention this tomorrow in more detail, we don't know how to deal with it at the institutional level. We don't know how to take your discovery, and I mean that with big D, not discrete discoveries, but to take your discovery and organize around it for effectiveness. We're still trying to take something that is so new, what it is you've created, and jam it into old structures, whether they be how we fund it or how we conduct oversight on it or how we plan for it, and so on. And I don't despair, but Robert, it's going to take some period of time before the community represented here begins to settle into roles that begin to resemble the familiarity of roles we might see on an NFL team. Sorry, let me, one final thought. I get a lot of questions about the intel community and the Director of National Intelligence and how that thing's working, and generally people throw out pretty pejorative terms, like stovepipes and failure to share and Cold War mentalities and so on. I try to cut through that and not focus on it. I simply say managing the IC is like managing any complex organization. And when you manage any complex organization, managing the American intelligence community, you have to balance two things that are virtues. One is autonomy of action for the parts, and the other is unity of effort for the whole. If you don't have enough autonomy of action, you lose initiative. If you don't have unity of effort, you're not synchronized. It's hard enough in the intelligence community. Now think with me for a moment. I've come here to learn from you. What's the right balance between individual autonomy and unity of effort in the technological realm that you represent? It's not anything, frankly, it's not something we've discovered. It's not something we've really had a discussion about. Because frankly, the flowering of your technology has been based upon an almost pure freedom of action from the individual level. And you probably heard from Jane this morning some of the challenges that we're facing in security, and you'll hear from me tomorrow about some of the challenges we face in security. That's the unity of effort guys coming in from the side door, bumping up against your autonomy and your freedom of action, which has created so much. It's going to be an interesting dialogue.
I'm going to go over to your formative years, growing up as the son of a welder, to driving a taxi, to director of the NSA and CIA. Who were the most important persons that impacted your life and direction?
Well, you mentioned Danny Rooney was my football coach in the 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. Dan was probably the first contact that I had with anyone whose personal experience was much beyond my neighborhood. And so I had that was really an opportunity to meet, be with him, to see some of the things that he was able to see the world through his eyes. Dan's now the U.S. ambassador to Ireland. He's no longer with the football team, and I must admit this is probably a bit selfish on my part, but after Dan got named to be ambassador, this individual who I viewed as a mentor and a teacher for me for half a century is calling me back, asking me how the federal government works. It was a tough question, but it was satisfying getting the question.
So speaking of full circle, on the way down here, you mentioned that you actually took over as coach, I think when you were in college?
Yeah, I mean, Dan was the coach. It's a Catholic grade school football league. I mean, Pittsburgh lives and dies in football. And Dan was my coach, and he got too busy with the Steelers. And so my last year in college and 2 years in graduate school, I took over the team.
Great.
And won more games than he did.
We have many young people in the audience, General. And most of us face that fork in the road where we have to decide what direction we intend to go. And not only just for young people, but people that are in the government looking at their exit strategy and the fear of potentially going from government public service into private industry and the risks that go with that. What made you decide to choose the public service road and why?
I'm going to answer that quickly, and then another thought strikes me, Robert. There was a war in Vietnam. ROTC was mandatory. I took the course, and everybody in my neighborhood joined the service, and so did I, and I stayed there. More broadly, and again, it comes back, I'm trying to just offer a few thoughts to this particular audience. I was at Sun Valley about a month ago for a conference put on by the Allen Corporation. And Allen invests in IT, entertainment, media companies. It was one of those events where you just kind of sat at the lunch table and said, I know him, I know her, I know him. I mean, it was people you'd well recognize. It was a wonderful conference, and it was the kind of the center of the universe of American technology and entrepreneurship. It was wonderful. About 2 weeks later, I had to take my wife, who's on the National Military Family Association board, down to a Purple Camp. It's a camp we put on for children of military people who are deployed. Okay, so they go to summer camp, but they go to summer camp with kids in the same circumstance, so it's a mutual support group. We were driving down I-95 and stopped to get a bite to eat at the last exit in North Carolina. We got off, there was only one place to eat, it was a truck stop. Okay. Now remember, a fresh memory of this experience in Sun Valley where, Bill and Melinda were getting on the elevator and Warren Buffett was walking by and so on. We walked into the truck stop. As you walk in, there's an announcement that every Thursday night there's a Bible study at the truck stop at 7 o'clock. There are Bible texts there for you to pick up. Went into the dining area, pretty full, so it was more than just the I-95 traffic. There were people coming from the neighborhood. Most of the men in there were eating dinner in their baseball caps. I had pulled pork sandwich and fried green tomatoes. There were 2 TV sets on, and both of them were on the Fox News. And I just had the thought that this is very different from that Sun Valley crowd. And my wife pointed out that if you asked how many of these people sitting around us here today had a close relative in the armed forces, the percentage at the truck stop in 995 would be significantly greater than the percentage you would gotten out of the folks at Sun Valley. And so I'm turning your question back on you, Robert, or maybe back on to friends in the audience. You watch the folks who volunteer for the American Security Services, the intelligence community, and the American Armed Forces. They are magnificent. How do we get that same kind of patriotism, selflessness, service before self out of the kinds of folks that are represented here and were represented at Sun Valley? I know one of your questions later for the panel is going to talk about the Manhattan Project. And why don't we have a Manhattan Project for cyber things? And one of the things I'm going to point out is the culture is different. And so you asked me about my life of service. I made a choice, and that's where I ended up. But more broadly, can the American Republic survive in the kind of world in which we are in if we take a disproportionate fraction of our public servants out of the families of those folks I saw in 995 as opposed to the folks I saw at Sun Valley?
Would you briefly talk about what you're doing today and how was that transition from public to private?
Yes, I left government service, not completely voluntarily, in February of 2009. I was concerned about, living that life and that pace and how things would be. I've surprised myself with being quite comfortable where I am. I enjoy the ability to say more things than I used to be able to say. I still can't say all the things I wish I could say, but being able to say more of the things has been quite rewarding. So, you ask about service, and I think it applies to all the folks in the room here as well. We each have an opportunity to contribute. And okay, I'm not in uniform, not in federal service, but frankly, most of the achievements